Hi, good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to see so many faces and many familiar faces here. So I'm Leigh Tost. I'll be your moderator for today. And thank you for joining us in this special forum on being human in the age of AI. This is an event that's happening in collaboration with the NOVA Forum Science and Religion series and the Neely Center for Ethical Decision Making, and of course here at the Marshall School of Business. And we want to also be sure to let you know that this event was made possible through the support of In Lumine, supporting the Catholic intellectual tradition on campuses nationwide, which is a grant from the John Templeton Foundation, grant number 62372. So we're very grateful for that support. And I'm really grateful to have you all here because this is a little bit of like two worlds colliding for me, in that I've been working here at Marshall since 2016, and I have had a wonderful time here, wonderful experience here. And my professional life is very much centered here. But in recent years, I have been reading a lot more broadly in philosophy and the Catholic intellectual tradition, and that brought me to the NOVA Forum. And so bringing these two ideas and groups and worlds together is really exciting. So I'm really happy to be able to have you all here. So, you know, one of the things that I would just highlight is that I think we've all been talking a lot about AI and ethics and the intersections there. Hopefully you've been talking about that over the last year, given current events, right? But I think usually when we talk about it, we talk about, okay, well, privacy, right? And security and transparency and accountability and all of those things really matter. But I think the topics that we'll be focusing on today take those kinds of concerns to a little bit more fundamental and even existential level. What does the onset of AI and generative AI mean for being human, for relationships? And so I think these are really exciting questions for us to be thinking about together. So today we have two panels. Panel one is entitled Human Identity and Creativity Between Computers and God. And we will have two speakers. So we're going to be starting off with Scott Roniger, who is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, where he currently holds the Father Robert H. Taylor S.J. Chair in Philosophy and directs the Roniger Center for Catholic Faith and Culture. He's published scholarly articles on metaphysics, Catholic social teaching, phenomenology, ethics, political philosophy, and philosophy and literature. So he's going to start us off with an opening 20 to 25 minutes or so, and then we'll have a response and some comments from Noreen Herzfeld, who will share her talk with us. She is the Nicholas and Bernice Raucher Professor of Science and Religion at St. John's University and the College of St. Benedict in Collegeville, Minnesota. She teaches courses in both computer science and theology. And she's the author of several books, including In Our Image, Artificial Intelligence, and Human Spirit. That's from 2002, and most recently, The Artifice of Intelligence, Divine and Human Relationships in the Age, which just came out last year. So really excited to hear from these two speakers, and then once they finish, we'll open it up for a conversation between the two of them, and then we'll invite your all's comments, questions, and ideas as well. So please join me in welcoming Professors Roniger and Herzfeld.
Okay, well, thank you for that introduction. And of course, I need to begin by thanking David, thanking Minte. I don't know where, there he is. Thank you very much for inviting me to contribute to this. The NOVA Forum is really, really an excellent, excellent program. I've been kind of watching it from a distance for a while, and I've gotten to know it a little bit more in the last few months, and I think they're doing fantastic work. I'm trying to do, let's say, something analogous in my own way, on my own campus, which is not too far away here at LMU. And I also want to mention and to thank the Lumen Christi Institute, which I believe has some connection to not just the NOVA Forum, but the event today, if I'm correct. And I've been working with the Lumen Christi Institute for a very, very long time now. I was very close friends with the founder, Thomas Levergood. So I want to recall his memory and thank them. So Michael Le Chevalier, if you're watching online, thank you very much, my friend. Okay, the title here for me, for my remarks, is what is artificial intelligence with scare quotes around both words, around each word individually, and why might we want it to be truly intelligent? So those are the questions I'm going to ask. I should begin by saying that last night over dinner at my house, my wife and I have 6 children, I was talking through some of the ideas that I wanted to talk about today and raising some of the same questions I'll raise with you. And my 13-year-old son, Jude, stopped me somewhat near the beginning of the conversation and said, "Dad, no one who has a dumb phone can give a lecture on artificial intelligence." Well, I'll let you be the judge of whether or not my son was correct at the end of this, but I wanted to begin with that story. But the questions that I'm raising are really, I think, in many ways, philosophical questions. So I feel a little bit like Socrates playing the gadfly to the Athenians. They all care about justice, but none of them take the time to stop and say, yes, but what is it? Not is this law just, or is that law just, or is this ruler just, but what is justice in and of itself? And those questions can often be, as the metaphor suggests, aggravating, stinging questions. But that's my job as a philosopher. So obviously this topic of artificial intelligence, what it is, what it does, what its potentials, both for good and ill, are, is extremely, extremely important and obviously very timely. But I would suggest that its timeliness prompts renewed reflection on perennial questions in a kind of Socratic style. AI is really a great springboard, I would say, not only to questions about policy debates, social commentary, questions about how this relates to warfare and those issues, which are obviously massively important, but it's also a great springboard to deep and careful philosophical and theological thinking. It invites us to raise anew those perennial questions, those fundamental questions that we all in some sense grapple with. What is a human person? What is intelligence? What is it to be artificial, to be real? What is nature? Is there a distinction between that which is natural and that which is artificial? What connection does intelligence, either real or artificial, have to God? So I'm going to approach some of these questions today, but to say that the development of artificial intelligence prompts philosophical thinking requires me to say something about the nature of philosophical inquiry and its relationship to more quotidian ways of exercising our human intelligence. So if you'll indulge me, I'm just going to spend a minute or two talking about what I think is something of the uniqueness of the philosophical approach, because I think it sets the right context for the rest of my remarks. One of the most important contributions of Edmund Husserl's phenomenology, Edmund Husserl was a very important German philosopher at the beginning of the last century, concerns the nature of philosophical thinking itself. If we are to think philosophically about being and truth, intelligence, we must, as Husserl says, achieve a perspective that enables us to inquire back into our subjective activities, both perceptual and intellectual activities, and that allow us to disclose things as they are. We must reorient our focus in order to reflect theoretically upon the correlation between our subjective activities and their objective targets. We must experience the experiencing of things, and we must, correlatively, look at the things we experience precisely as experienced by us. For our purposes today, we must exercise our intelligence towards the topic of intelligence itself, and toward its correlation with being, insofar as being is disclosed by human intelligence. Husserl shows that philosophy is occupied with, quote, the knower's reflecting upon himself and his knowing life. And he says that the philosophical perspective lies here, situated above our default practical orientation toward the objects with which we must deal in our everyday activities. Socrates says much the same in multiple different dialogues. In these contemplative activities, highlighting the correlation between consciousness and the appearing of things in the world, the philosopher, quote, loses nothing of their being and their objective truths, and likewise nothing at all of the spiritual acquisitions of his own life world, or those of the whole historical communal life. He simply forbids himself, as a philosopher, in the uniqueness of the direction of his interest, to continue the whole natural performance of his normal practical life. Thus, for the philosopher, all practical, unreflective interests are put out of play, so that we can achieve the distance from which philosophy, quote, helps us think about the first and final issues and helps us to know ourselves. That last quote is taken from Robert Sokolowski, and I'll say a bit about him in one more minute. But before we enter into philosophy, we are concerned with who and what we are, with human goods, with political authority and friendship, and of course with intelligence and truth. When we shift up into philosophical thinking, we begin to look at the things we normally live through. So as I always tell my students, when we begin philosophy, we'll ask questions like, what is a word? You're always living through speech, you're always living through language, but philosophy requires you to step back from each individual word and ask the question, what is it that you do when I speak a word? What is a word? It requires you to look at the things you normally live through. So in philosophical thinking, we seek to understand not John or Margaret, but human nature itself. Not what is good to pursue in this or that situation, but the good as such. Not whether this or that statement or idea is intelligent, but what intelligence itself is. Full stop. In philosophy, we desire to know not simply the truth about a specific issue, as important as that is, but rather the truth about truth itself. As Aristotle says, quote, rightly then is philosophy called the science of truth. In all of these activities, we leave the world and our activities within it untouched because we have to wonder about their nature, which is very, very importantly distinct from doubting their existence. As Husserl says, quote, phenomenological explanation does nothing but explicate the sense this world has for all of us, prior to any philosophizing, and obviously gets solely from our experience, a sense which philosophy can uncover but never alter. Can machines do that? I don't know. Once we achieve this contemplative stance vis-a-vis being and truth, I would suggest the most important tool in the toolkit of philosophy is the making of strategic distinctions. When I distinguish something, I can see that this is not that. And if this is not that, it means that this has its own being, its own nature, its own intelligibility, which means it's necessarily not that. So it's precisely in the distinction that the intelligibility of each thing shines forth towards me, right? Distinctions are much more fundamental than syllogisms. They're much more fundamental than inference or deduction or any other kind of calculation. We can only make inferences, do syllogisms, and do other kinds of calculations because we've already distinguished different things. We've already seen that this is not that, and therefore this has its own being and intelligibility. So in everything I've just said, really, and in everything I'm going to say, I'm massively indebted to the work of Robert Sokolowski. So even when I'm not quoting Sokolowski directly, my work is really flowing from him, as it is from Anton Barbacke, who has a very, very interesting book on artificial intelligence. So I'm recognizing my debt to them right from the beginning, and I'm happy to provide quotations and other references to their work throughout. Okay, so with this context set, I think what I need to do now is to proceed through a series of questions. I'm going to move from one set of questions to another. And the motor that's going to get me through these different series of questions is trying to draw strategic distinctions at each step. So here's the first set of questions that I think need to be raised. What does it mean to be artificial? Can something be artificial and real, or are all artificial things fake? Those are the first couple of questions I want to look at. So let's look at, I think, a first fundamental point here. It's often claimed that historically, philosophy really begins, in a sense, with the dawning of the distinctions, and really the reflection upon these distinctions, between that which is natural, that which is artificial, that which is by law or by custom. So in Greek, this is the strategic distinctions between physis, or nature, techne, or art, production, that which is artificial, and nomos, which is law or custom. Briefly put, that which is by nature, that which has its own physis, is something which has its own intrinsic source of unity, life, and operation. Natural things reproduce themselves, and they have an intrinsic kind of unity, an intrinsic kind of orientation towards their own activities which perfect them in the kind of thing that they are. Natural things have this own intrinsic source of life, unity, and motion. Things which are by techne, things which are by art, artificial things, are of course fabricated things. There's nothing in the materials in this which unify themselves. They have to be unified by an external agent, namely the artificer, or the one who's fabricating anything artificial. So techne goes from everything from this table to the light bulbs to the chairs, this, my pen, watch. It has no intrinsic source of unity. It has to be given that unity and therefore the function by someone who can make it, by someone who has some sense, the artist in some sense, to produce it. That which is by nomos is that which is something like our settled ways of living together. That which is by law or custom is something like our settled habits of living and acting together. Okay, I'm going to concentrate on the distinction between nature and art, or between physis and techne, because the question of artificial intelligence is really parasitic, or it's secondary to the distinction between natural and artificial intelligence. So let me begin now here by saying there's a really important ambiguity in the word artificial. And again, I take this directly from Sokolowski's work on artificial intelligence. All natural beings are begotten and born. They have their own natural genesis and reproduction. All fabricated things are artificial, and all artificial things are fabricated. But there's a very important distinction between the artificial as real or genuine, even though imitative, and the artificial as fake. So, for example, there's lots of artificial light in this room, but artificial light is real light. Artificial light is not natural light. It's fabricated in some real sense. It comes from a light bulb which was produced by someone or by some company, but it doesn't merely appear to be light. It is light. It functions as light. It really does illuminate things. Now, perhaps doesn't have the full function of natural light from the sun or from stars, but it does in fact function as real light. Artificial wood, I assume this is artificial wood, artificial wood by contrast is not real wood. It merely appears to be wood. It mimics wood, but it doesn't act like wood. If you burn it, it doesn't burn like wood. If you bend it, it doesn't bend or break like wood. It does not function like wood. It merely appears to be wood. So we have the artificial as, let's say, the merely apparent, like the fake wood or the artificial wood. And then we have the artificial as the fabricated but real, like the artificial light in this room. That distinction, I think, is really, really fundamental, because once we have that distinction on the table, we can ask the question, is artificial intelligence fabricated but real intelligence? Or is it not intelligence at all, but something constructed such that it only appears to be that which it imitates? Is artificial intelligence like the artificial and thus fake wood? I hope this is fake wood. Or is artificial intelligence like the artificial but real light from these light bulbs? That, I think, is a really important starting point. However, to answer that question, we must first ask and answer a second set of questions. What is intelligence? How is intelligence related to being, to the existence, and to the nature of things? What are the essential operations of intelligence in relationship to the being of things? Here's a direct quote from Sokolowski. Quote, "Human reason is not just the power to move from one proposition to another. It is not just the ability to argue, infer, and compute. More fundamentally, it is the capacity to let things come to light, to let the intelligibility of things show up for ourselves and for others. Instances of such intelligence serve as both the starting points and the points of rest or stability amid the movements of argument. Reason, therefore, encompasses both reasoning and intelligence. Also, in its practical forms, reason is the power by which we are able to perform human actions and to fabricate things, artificial things," end quote. In another text from a different work, an earlier work, Sokolowski says that, quote, "the mind is both receptive and active. The mind," he says, "is a gerundial noun. The verb to mind, or the gerund minding, expresses its nature. The intellect is not a substance independent of its activity, because mind is properly named as the minding of things, the having of their presences as well as their absences, and all the complexities this involves." So the mind or intelligence is most fundamentally the disclosure of things, the ability to allow the intelligibility of things to inform me, to grasp me, you might say, and others. And the mind or intelligence encounters the being of things both in their presence and in their absence, which is a magnificent and wonderful activity of human intelligence, without which we couldn't be human. So if I were to talk to you right now about St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, you would be encountering the very reality of that basilica, the intelligibility of that basilica in the absence of it. And if we were to go to St. Peter's and see it in its presence, you would recognize the identity of it. This is an activity of intelligence. It's the ability to allow the intelligibility of things to come forward in the presence and absence of those things. The mind, therefore, or intelligence, is that through which I disclose and encounter the being of things, and it enables me to establish relationships with being and with others who can similarly disclose being in communion with me and others. Therefore, the distinction between calculation and inference making on the one hand, and disclosure of being leading to communion with others on the other hand, is essential. It's fundamental. Both are activities of intelligence, to be sure, but the disclosure of being in communion with others is more fundamental. And I would suggest that something like making a distinction, the dawning of a distinction, pertains to that more fundamental activity of human intelligence, allowing the intelligibility of things to come forward for me and for others. These distinctions lead to another, which again I think is central for us. The embodied predication of human beings, human speakers, as distinct from deracinated model building. Predication, or human speech, begins in sensation but transcends it. I encounter something for the first time through some kind of perception, some kind of bodily sensation, and when I articulate that through a predication, my intelligence has raised that perception to a higher level. So human predication is bodily, but at the same time, because it's an activity of intelligence, it transcends the level of merely material causality. And predication has for its perfection the truth of things. Predication is oriented towards naturally, physis, naturally towards the truth of being, the truth of reality. In predication, I declare myself as speaking. I can say the word I, and I do all the time, as you do. I declare myself as speaking and thus as responsible for manifesting things as they are. And so predication flows from, leads to, and perfects social life in common with others, as we in common can articulate the nature of the things around us, the things themselves, as Husserl always says. But models are not predications. As Husserl shows, we have the power to abstract from the being of things. We can, and we do, pull ourselves out of and away from what Husserl calls the Lebenswelt, the life world within which we all naturally live and move and have our being. And when we do so, when we move away from the normal way of human beings encountering reality, encountering the world around us, when we pull ourselves out of that, we can construct what he calls theory forms that are correlated with not the being of things, but with but they are correlated with what we can call models. Some of these models do eventually relate back down to the existence and to the nature of things, but very indirectly, in a kind of an abstract way and from a distance. And some of these models, in fact, do not relate to the being of things at all. The perfection of something like a theory form and its model, the perfection of these really is not truth, but consistency and inner coherence within the model itself. These kinds of models exist as fabricated intellectual products, and their producers strive without end, it seems, to streamline them and to make them more consistent and more coherent within the model itself. Furthermore, these kinds of models tend toward a kind of homogenization of discourse. Scientists and mathematicians all use the same theory, or at least they're trying to get to a point where the theories can converge, because their work aims at a kind of algorithm or a kind of an equation of some sort, which really is not language at all. It's certainly not the language of predication. Thus, these models necessarily bleach out the richness and the diversity of the being of things, and those who attempt to bespeak the being of things. Their own individuality and personality is kind of bleached out when you move up into a kind of a model, right? Now, many commentators and practitioners describe, who, by the way, who know much more about, let's say, the ins and outs and the technicalities of AI than I do, but many of these commentators and even practitioners often describe AI precisely as a model. And I think they do very, very well in this regard. To take only one recent example, Eric Schmidt, who is a former CEO and executive chairman of Google and co-founder of the research group Schmidt Sciences, speaks of models or computer programs that form the basis of artificial intelligence. The operations of these models are fast, powerful, and impressive. But as models, they remain unplugged, I would say, from the being of things. And there simply is nothing in them that can get out of the model, for there is nothing other than the model there. That's, I think, an important point to see. So once you abstract from a kind of encounter with the reality of things, you can begin to construct computer programs which really are correlated with models. And those models are, in fact, detached from reality. They're sort of unplugged from it, we might say. And then the problem, or let's say the task, becomes the consistency and the coherence within the model. But how do you get out of the model? Well, there's nothing in the model that lets you get out of it. And my suggestion is that we should understand, as again, some of the more sort of, some of the own practitioners of AI understand AI to be something like a computer-generated model, which strives towards a kind of consistency. Thus, on the one hand, we have the embodied, and I would say with Plato, the erotic, in the sense of the desiring for union, and therefore the free exercise of intelligence, in which we express ourselves as responsible speakers through predications that are naturally oriented toward achieving the truth of the being of things in common with others. And on the other hand, we have the computer program model, that is AI, which we produce, or which someone produces, through equations, through mathematical operations, and which operates with a kind of algorithm that is disembodied, disconnected in certain ways from being, and whose operations are in fact commanded by its producers and users. The perfection of AI is not the truth of being that forms the basis of a common life with others, but rather the coherence and consistency of the algorithm and its products. What we call AI, or artificial intelligence, I would suggest then, is the fabricated operations within a model of coherence, not predications disclosing the truth of being. AI is not the understanding of something, but rather a programmed operation that rearranges marks within a model detached from the being and nature and existence of things. As Aristotle says, the human being is the animal having logos, but AI is no animal and does not speak a logos of being. So when Aristotle gives a kind of a definition of the human being, he doesn't have the word person, doesn't have that idea, you might say, or that reality, but the human being, he talks about the human being as the animal having logos. And he's clearly thinking about predications that disclose reality for ourselves and for others. And again, AI is no animal and speaks no logos of being. These reflections lead to another set of questions. Can such AI operations be true? Are they true? Are the products of artificial intelligence true in any sense? And of course, that forces us to ask the perennial question, what is truth? So I begin with that. And this will only take 2 or 3 hours, and then we can move on. Or a lifetime, really. So I begin with Aristotle on truth, very quickly. If someone says of what is that it is, or of what is not that it is not, such a person has spoken the truth. Best definition to begin with on truth. Saying of what is that it is, and of what is not that it is not, that is to do the truth. And he uses the word doing the truth. He uses truth as a verb. Truthing would be the literal translation of what he says. So if someone says of what is that it is, or of what is not that it is not, that person has truthed for Aristotle. And of course, falsity is the opposite. Saying of what is that it is not, or of what is not that it is. That is to do the false for Aristotle. And here I think it's worth remembering or bringing up that the Greek word for truth is aletheia, which means literally uncovered or uncovering. to disclose being through the medium of speech. That's what truth is, right? So language is somehow a kind of an instrument to literally disclose, to manifest, to show forth a being that's already there with its own nature, with its own physis. It's not to create it. It's not to speak it into existence. Only God can do that. But to truth something is to uncover it, to disclose it, to manifest it. And the way we do that, again, for Aristotle, for Plato, for the, let's say the whole classical tradition, is primarily through speech, through language. Aquinas has another great definition of truth, which is building upon the ones that I just mentioned. And he speaks about truth as the adequation of the mind to the thing, the adequation of the mind to reality. When we achieve truth, our minds are unified, they're united to the things themselves as those things really are. And as Husserl shows, in order to achieve the truth, we must come down from the model and encounter the things themselves again. He's very, very good on this. To remain within the model is to remain in a way which is not yet oriented to the truth of things, right? So to achieve truth, our minds have to be united to the things themselves, but to do that, we have to get down back out of the model and encounter the things in what Husserl calls the Lebenswelt, the world as it is, we might say. In a recent book with the fantastic title, Filter World, How Algorithms Flatten Culture, Kyle Shaken, I hope I pronounced that correctly, recommends that we apply the wisdom of the slow food movement to culture, and really to social life as a whole. And he says, quote, "If we shift our priorities away from the pace of algorithmic digital platforms and once more to the physical world, we might find ourselves building not only better culture, but better communities, relationships, and politics as well." What Sheikha calls the physical world can be fleshed out, I think, by Husserl's reflections on what we've called the life world, the Lebenswelt. And if we return more often to it, to the world as it is, to the things themselves, we can perhaps set the conditions within which being can disclose itself to us. And so perhaps we can achieve the truth of being as the basis of our interactions, instead of remaining within the products of a model that tend to isolate us from each other and to deracinate us from the being of things, which, by the way, is not to say that models don't have their place. They do. They can be fantastically important and helpful, but all models have this feature. It's part of, you might say, the nature of the model is to have this kind of structure, right? They can be used well, I think, once you know that. And here's the real, if I can say this right, here's where the rubber meets the road. When you come down out of the model and you encounter reality again, you always see that the model is an abstraction of some kind. It necessarily filters out some of the texture of reality. And then the question becomes, do you try to change the reality to fit the model, or do you change the model so that it is closer to reality and maybe less perfect as a model, right? That, in a sense, I think, is the whole modern problem with the expertise or the expert class. They live in models, and I could give 1,000 examples of this. And the tendency is that once you achieve the kind of mathematical perfection of the model, you want to reform reality to be in line with the model, instead of realizing that the model is always going to have these imperfections, so that you should just adjust the model the best you can with a kind of humility, because it's never going to disclose reality, because it's not a predication. It's never going to disclose it fully. Or again, do you become, well, tyrannical and try to adjust reality to fit the model? There's the big issue. Okay. The products of AI, the words that are generated on a screen that my students are now tempted to plagiarize, if that's the right word, to use as their own words, are not true in any real sense of that reality. The products of AI are not true. They're just not. There's no mind united to reality when you see those products on a screen. The products of AI are not true. They are at best occasions or prompts for us to climb out of the cave and see the things themselves in the light of day. So what are my conclusions? AI is artificial intelligence the way that artificial wood is wood. That is, I would suggest it's not intelligence at all. It's a fabrication that imitates the appearance of intelligence but does not truly achieve it, even in a diminished way. It's not like artificial light, that's real light. It's like artificial wood, which is simply not wood. Therefore, its products are not true, even when they're factually correct. Again, they're at best occasions for us to go back to the things themselves and for us to achieve the truth of things. One word about language really quickly, because I'm running out of time. If we go back to that distinction between art and nature, the entire classical tradition, and in many ways the Catholic intellectual tradition, says that it's art that imitates nature, not vice versa. Nature does not imitate art. Art imitates nature. Nature is more fundamental, more rooted in being. And if art imitates nature, which it does, and not nature art, then we have to speak that way, right? Because that's the way things are. That's the way being is. And everyone from Confucius to Plato to Aristotle to Walker Percy stress that calling things by their right names is wisdom. Even Machiavelli knows this in his own way. Machiavelli's advice to the new prince is to rename everything he can, because he knows by changing the names of things, you change the way people think about reality, and you can begin to try to falsify the way things are. So you can just track this. So my sense is that we have to sort of reclaim this understanding that art imitates nature, not vice versa. The mind is not software. The brain is not hardware. It's just the opposite. Software imitates, in some sense of imitates, the mind. Hardware imitates, in some sense of imitates, the brain, which is a living organ, not a machine. Okay, so AI is not intelligence, but it's fabricated. It's a computing program that produces an increasingly inconsistent model. So let me close here with a final question. Why might we want to call AI, why might we want it to be real intelligence? I take my answer to this question is very close to the work of Professor Herzfeld. Perhaps we want our computer programs and models to be intelligent because we want to be our own creators. We want to create a human intelligence that will serve as a perverse imitation of God, the Creator and Redeemer. Perhaps we want to be the creator of the mind, of truth and falsity, and of good and evil. Our desire for AI to be real intelligence is an expression of our desire to worship ourselves as God, as our own creator. It's Genesis 1 through 3 all over again. Professor Herzfeld, in a very, very interesting article from 2002, leaves open the possibility that AI is not in itself idolatrous. But I will ask, insofar as we call AI artificial intelligence, is this not somehow at least potentially idolatrous? I suggest that we can and we should also learn something of the same lesson from Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, written in 429, or at least appearing in 429 BC. Remember that Oedipus answered the riddle of the Sphinx, which gave him access to the city. The answer to that riddle was man. Oedipus carries something of the secret answer to the riddle of man and our social and political life. So what does it mean for a man like Oedipus to murder his father, marry his mother, and generate children with her? What does this patricide and incest signify? Perhaps it's an image that shows us the distorted tendency we have to attempt to be our own creators, to generate ourselves according to our own intelligence and initiative. And perhaps it reveals to us that when we try to be our own creators, when we try to make ourselves into our own gods so as to control our own personal, social, and political lives according to the good and evil that we create, we bring about a plague on our society, as Oedipus does. And when he finds out what his life is and what he has done to himself, to his family, and to his city, he tears his eyes out and wanders the rest of his life as a blind man. Is there a way to avoid this fate? I'm just a Catholic intellectual, so I say yes. The way to avoid it is to turn again to the Word incarnate, who is the way, the truth, and the life. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to pick up where Scott left off. He is talking about artificial intelligence. I want to talk about us, because the question that really got me interested in combining artificial intelligence with theology was the question, why do we want it? Why are we trying to make the computer in our own image? In other words, if we only thought of artificial intelligence as Roombas that sweep the floor or rovers that send information back from Mars. They're clearly tools, and they're good tools. We tend to think of tools generally something not turned on here. Turn it off and on.
Yeah.
Okay.
Did that do it?
Nope. Maybe I didn't leave it off enough.
Did that
That does it. Yeah.
But it's not making.
Oh,
There
there we go. We got it going. Okay. Technology, right. We tend to think of technology, of our tools, as amplifiers of parts of our condition. So, just as the telescope amplifies our eyes, the telephone amplifies our hearing. We get to AI, it amplifies our intelligence, or does it substitute for our intelligence? So it seems, as Scott pointed out, that we want to create something that is in our own image. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Create something that is in our own image. Where have I heard that before? And so it's interesting because, for example, in this MIT brochure, they said scientists, philosophers, and theologians are mystified by the cognitive processes that give rise to consciousness and to the human soul. Whoa, the human soul just turned into, a process. So now we're saying we not only are looking at artificial intelligence, maybe we're looking at artificial souls. What are we looking for when we look for AI? So here are some of my questions that I want to address today. So obviously, if we are trying to make something in our own image, we are also, at least we think of ourselves in the Judeo-Christian tradition, as being made in the image of God. So how do we understand the way we image God, and how do we understand the way we want the computer to image us? And are these images the same, or are they going to be different? What are we ultimately looking for when we look for a strong AI, or today the terminology is an AGI, an artificial general intelligence that is like us? A more visual picture would be to say, okay, maybe it's going to turn out like this, where humanity is in the middle and we overlap with God in one area, we overlap with computers in a completely different area. Or maybe it's going to turn out to look more like this, where humanity is in the center and there's something that is sort of a core that we think is the way we image God and also the way we want computers to image us. So I thought, okay, got to learn some theology. I was a computer scientist when I started asking these questions, and I thought, oh, this would be a great topic to write on. And then I was like, yeah, I can't do it. It's not a computer science question. So I took a deep dive into theology and said, all right, how do we image God? So obviously the idea that we image God comes from Genesis 1, where we have, then God said, let us make humankind in our image according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, the cattle, and all the wild animals of the earth, and every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. Okay, so your image kind of brackets this whole text. I'd like to also point to a few things in that text. The whole center is all the dominion stuff, dominion over all the other creatures. At the end, you get the themness, that God created more than one of us, okay, and male and female. So historically, in the Christian church, there have been three ways of understanding this image. And I call them substantive, functional, and relational. So substantive would say the image is some attribute. Maybe it's our intelligence, our ability to be rational. The functional says, no, the image is realized in action. Another way you might hear this expressed is when people say we are God's hands on earth. We function in God's stead. Or the image could be relational and be found in our relationships with each other. So I want to look carefully at these three. First, as they appear in Christian theology, and then as they appear in computer science or in artificial intelligence. So if we start with image as an attribute, so Descartes, I think, therefore I am. This says, well, the image of God is reason, kind of an extended reason. It's held as a property by individuals, and it likens us to God in this attributive or substantive way. This is the way that almost all of the early church fathers thought about image and how we image God. They said, well, God is intelligent, God is rational, so are we. We're more intelligent, more rational than the animals. Aristotle describes us as the rational animal, and the Christian thinkers took off from that standpoint and said, okay, it's our intelligence, it's our thinking and our reason. And we see this as the image right up through the early 20th century. So sort of one of the last significant places where we see the image of God described this way is in Reinhold Niebuhr's work in The Nature and Destiny of Man. But when you get to the turn of the 20th century, a lot of biblical scholars say, what does that got to do with the text we just read? The text we just read talked about dominion and it talked about relationship, but it didn't talk about reason. It didn't talk about intellect. And so the biblical scholars said, no, you got to stick to the text. So they said, well, where else is image used as a word at the same time that the Bible was being written, that Genesis was being written? And it was being used where a king might set up a statue in a far-flung land, and that statue was called the image of the king. Or the king might send a deputy to a far-off land, and that deputy would call himself, and it was probably a him, the image of the king. And he functioned in the king's stead. So when we think of image as function, it's found in performance. It's dynamic. It's like what the deputy does out in the provinces. And this fits nicely with the text because you could say, well, all that dominion stuff is very functional, that we're supposed to have dominion over the creatures of the earth. So it fits with the text and with the way image was used when that text was written. But that's not the last word on image, because around the middle of the 20th century, the systematic theologians say, okay, we got a problem with this. And our problem is, what about people who are disabled? What about people who are not very functional? Whether it's babies or, those who are ill, confined to a hospital bed. What about the elderly who can no longer do a lot of stuff? Do they then cease to be in the image of God because they're not very functional? So they said, let's look at a specific function. Let's try relationship. Okay? That the image now is found not in a single person, but only between two people in the relationship that they have with one another. Christian dogmatic theologians particularly like this because they said, we believe in a triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. God is a relationship. And so if God is a relationship, we probably image God when we have relationships. And those relationships can be with one another, or it could be like the relationship of an individual to God and God's self. So now the image isn't found in any person, it isn't found in any action, it's found in the relationship between us. There was a feeling that this was a little better than the functional definition because it, you still have a relationship with someone who is ill or someone who is disabled. Hopefully, they still have a relationship with God as well. And we see this really spelled out in the Swiss theologian Karl Barth's Church Dogmatics. So, how about in AI? Well, it turns out that if you look back at the history of AI, it follows exactly the same trajectory. In other words, people started out by saying, okay, it's intelligence. What is intelligence? Intelligence is logical reasoning and symbol manipulation. So we start with symbolic AI that said, we could probably code up intelligence in some sort of a symbolic system, and this will give us intelligent computers. It works well in realms like game playing, like chess, where you have a limited number of pieces on a limited board. It doesn't work very well in the real world because the real world isn't that easily codified. So it kind of runs into the common sense problem that there's so much that we know and we don't even know how we know it. We learn so many things when we're little kids. I think about the idea of a little kid playing in a sandbox, and you might not think they're learning much at all, but really they're learning about liquid dynamics as they pour the sand from one container to another. They're learning about gravity, the way the sand goes down. When they throw the sand in their sister's face, they're learning about human relationships. And so there's just a lot that we learn that's very hard to codify as some kind of a system, the way chess is easy to codify, or calculus, or something like that. So the first easy successes back in the 1960s in AI run into this common sense problem. They can't get out of these narrowly defined models, which comes back to what Scott was saying. So we get into the 1980s, and AI says, okay, how about AI as function? We're not going to worry about trying to make the AI have some codified system of reasoning. We're just going to write programs that actually get out there and do stuff that humans do. So you could take the Mars rover as an excellent example of this. Roomba is an excellent example of this. It does one thing, it vacuums the floor. It does it very well, and it tortures the cat. But, other than that, it doesn't do anything else. It does a function, and it serves as our deputy for floor vacuuming, or rover is our deputy on Mars when we are not there. And so we see the exact progression from a sort of symbolic idea of intelligence to a functional notion of it. And we run into the exact same problem. In other words, people, watch the Roomba running around and they say that's really cute and I'm glad the floor is clean, but that isn't really intelligence. That isn't really what we were looking for. So you ask the question, what functions are necessary or sufficient? And kind of bump up against a wall with that. Now, so that led in the, I'd say the late 1990s and moving into our century to folks saying, maybe it's all about relationship after all. And this came about, especially when people like Rodney Brooks at MIT said, how am I going to get enough information, enough experience into an AI? And they said the only way is going to be for it to be able to learn. It has to learn like human beings do, and learning, it takes a relationship within an environment. When you think about the Turing test, it's relationally determined. The Turing test, you know, is not about the computer knowing any particular thing. It's about the computer being able to interact in a conversation in a relational way. So when you think also about things like ChatGPT, it's the same thing. It's relational. You ask it a question, it comes back with an answer. And generally, we're not just looking for a factual answer. Most of its answers aren't all that factual. It tends to make stuff up, right? But we're looking for something that sounds right to us. And so we're looking at it in a relational way. Because it turns out that intelligence is socially acquired, it's socially produced, and it's socially demonstrated. So one characteristic that is fundamental to intelligence is its relational nature. And certainly the AI in science fiction is all highly relational. And so if you look at science fiction as an indicator of our dreams and our desires, it means we're looking for something relational. So here we are, you know, same progression in theology, in understanding the image of God, and in computer science and trying to get the computer to image us. So my next question, well, all right, why did this happen? You know, why do we have this parallel? Why are we looking at computers this way? In a way, I think we are looking for a companion. Okay? It can be lonely being the only thinking creatures on Earth. And so I think as we have, as a society, moved away from religions in which we have a relationship with God, and we may also have a relationship with the communion of saints, the angels. We're in Los Angeles, right? And then we feel a void. St. Augustine wrote, "Lord, you have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." And so there's this void that we say, well, okay, we could talk to the animals maybe, so we maybe try that. So far we haven't gotten too far with that. We could scan the heavens with a SETI project looking for ET to be out there somewhere, but we haven't gotten too far with that either. Or we could create an other with whom we can relate, and this other will then fill that void that is left when we no longer believe in God or the saints or the angels. Another thing we might be looking for is immortality. Here's Ray Kurzweil, who says, as we cross the divide to instantiate ourselves into our computational technology, our identity will be based on our evolving mind file. We'll be software. Our immortality will be a matter of being sufficiently careful to make frequent backups. Well, okay, in a society that, again, is no longer religious, the fear of death comes back in. Okay, Scott talked about Eros, but I'm going to talk about Thanatos here. That we are also afraid of our death, and so we look to our creatures as two possible forms of immortality. Kurzweil thinks it's personal immortality. You know, there are many others who just say, no, computers will be the next step in evolution, and it's a sort of a species immortality rather than a personal immortality. And so we find, here's a Russian, Dmitry Itskov, with his 2045 project, saying, well, okay, we map the human genome, why can't we map the connectome of the brain? And then we could just put it on a chip, and then we can upload our own particular connectome, and we can be immortal. It isn't just crazy billionaires in Russia that are thinking about this. Back in the Obama administration, we initiated the Brain Initiative for $3 billion, and the EU, the Human Brain Project. So there are multiple projects out there working in this direction. So how close are we? This idea is based on the fact that, not the fact, the supposition that we are nothing but information. Francis Crick said, you, your joys, your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will, you're nothing but a pack of neurons. That you are just the connections inside your brain. If this were true, and there are many who think this is true, then it could be possible to reproduce that in some other platform than cellular matter. In that case, artificial intelligence might then function more like the real would than the fake would, if we could do this. How close are we to being able to do this? Well, it's pretty complicated for a number of reasons. The size of the brain, 80 to 90 billion neurons, each with thousands of connections, with connections that are not static, but are continually changing. Every time you have a beer, you're changing your connections. Every time you learn something new, you're changing your connections. New neurons come online as old ones die. Tasks are distributed. They're not in one area. I can't say it's this connection right here, that shows that I know 2 + 2 = 4. Things are all over the brain. New areas take on old tasks. So when parts of your brain are damaged, new areas will take over for that. And there's more. So we also have a whole bunch of neurons in our gut, a whole second brain in a sense. And there's even more than that. There's all of the bacteria, the microbiota in our body. 90% of you is not human. It's the microbiota that you carry around in your gut, on your skin, and it affects the brain. So it is a part of an entire system of knowing. So the task is a lot bigger than those guys are thinking. We'd not only have to map the brain, we got to map the whole darn body and the microbiota too. Okay? So there's also an ontological question. It could turn out that all data would erase on transplant, and that knowledge is unique to an individual organism, that copying the connectome would not be operative. Okay. And I always ask the question, well, suppose you could copy your brain to a computer, when should you do it? Should you do it when you're 14 and you know everything? Should you do it when you're in your 20s and you're at the height of your mathematical and computational prowess? Should you do it when you're older and you have so many more experiences and memories to copy? Or why not do it every 10 years? But then you say, which one is me? Because each one is going to be vastly different. It is our body that gives us our unique ontological being. If we could copy that, we could copy it multiple times. We could copy it at multiple times in our lifespan, and there would be many yous. They could all get in a big fight, Might be kind of interesting. So we often think, well, we don't need the body, okay, because of sickness, because the body is emotional, and maybe we wouldn't want to be emotional, but we really do need it. And here we'll come to the sort of Catholic part of this. Christianity itself is a very embodied faith. If you think about the two major feasts of Christianity, Christmas, the incarnation, that we believe that God came and actually took on a human body in order to have a full relationship with us. Easter, the resurrection. We say in our creed we believe in the resurrection of the body, that the resurrection is not just our soul wafts off to heaven, but that we are come back in an embodied form. And then, of course, there's the Eucharist. This is my body given for you. All the sacraments involve a physical element, involve the body in some way. So we have an embodied faith. Why create an AGI? Again, this sort of goes back over things we already mentioned. Functionally, might give us better dominion over the earth. Relationally, it might give us an other to relate to instead of God. Now, should we do that, Scott, then we have created an idol, because we have created something that is a stand-in for the relationships that we are called to have with each other and with our Creator. So I think I'm going to stop there. I have a few more questions, but I think it would be good for us to have some time for discussion.
Well, thank you both so much. That's fascinating in many ways, and there's a lot to digest and a lot to think about. We have I think about 15-ish minutes for questions. So I want to start by just seeing if there are any questions from the audience that people want to raise, given our limited time. Okay, then I'll start us off. I just didn't want to be greedy. So, okay. I'd love to start off just sort of thinking about the connections between the two talks. And so I'll share a couple quick thoughts in the order of the talks. And one of the things that I was thinking about when you were contrasting the thing in itself and a model, right? And you seem to put AI entirely in the model, right? And then Noreen, you sort of pushed the notion of AI a little further than it's a model. I felt like as you were going through the sequence, right? So that when we're, maybe you can think of the Romba and the functional mode or the attribute mode as fundamentally just a model. When you get into the relational types of AGI or generative AI, however people like to say it, I'm not up on this month's term, but when you get to that level, it is, I think, and there's probably many people in the room who are engineers that might be able to tell us more about this, but I think that part of what the model is supposed to be doing is then learning from its environment, right? And so it is taking in that information. And so I'm just curious about your all's thoughts about that intersection there. Like, does that challenge the way in which you distinguished between, like, AI can't be real or it can't be true because it's just a model and you're trapped in the model? Well, if the model is learning from the world, is that, and then how would you see some of the more complicated or complex forms informing these ideas? And I don't know which one of you might be interested to start.
I think if you go back to the first approach to AI, the substantive approach, in which we thought we could capture intelligence in a symbolic system, that is just clearly a model. We thought that we could just model intelligence with some kind of a mathematical or symbolic system. And while we could do that in limited areas, it failed pretty badly. I think if you look at the functional AI, you could say it's a thing. Rover is a thing, a Roomba is a thing, and it does a certain function. I wouldn't say the Roomba is a fake vacuum cleaner. It's a vacuum cleaner, okay? But it's just a tool. Okay, now when you get to the relational part, here we're trying to make AI into some kind of a partner. And I'm going to say a lot more about that in the next forum later this afternoon. But, you know, we haven't gotten there, really. You could say ChatGPT is a good story generator, but is it a true interlocutor? There, I think you're in a realm where it can be a little bit of both. You know, you could say, well, it sort of models human speech. But then sometimes you can say it actually produces something. So it's, yeah, it's a productive model.
Right, right. What's your...
Well, there's so much to say about all of this. And I would say one of the fundamental distinctions that I want to keep in mind here is, and I'll use Jung's understanding of a tool or an instrument, which he says is really a kind of an extension of the human will. So, I mean, the spear is an extension of my desire to kill something or to, you know, to protect myself, whether it's for, you know, to protect or to eat or whatever. And so I think we have to be really careful when we say things like the machine is learning or the machine is doing X, Y, Z. Really, I would say the truth of it is that we're doing something through the machine. And I think that's really, really important because, again, go back to the weight of words, the weight of language. It's meant to illuminate a reality. As soon as you start saying that the machine is learning, doing, speaking, you're granting it a form of unity and agency, which it in fact doesn't have. I think the deeper truth is, and I think I like Jung's definition, we are doing something through the machine or through the program. There's nothing there to be learned for the thing because it doesn't have the proper kind of unity to a natural learning kind of whole. It's an artifact. Somebody produced it. So I would want to say, and I guess I'm just, I'm doubtful that the newer forms of AI are not modeled. I think they are. They're more complex, and they're models which are meant to kind of functionality. As I said, they do give you, right? But those are products which, again, are sort of meant to be sort of consistent and coherent within them. And by the way, the language model, I'm taking that from people who are writing about contemporary, you know, these are things that have been published in the last few weeks. So I'm suspicious, but as a good friend of mine who writes sometimes on philosophy of science says, when a philosopher starts talking about science or technology, you should hold your wallet. So I'm an observer of this, so you'd have to get someone who could give you the nitty-gritty engineering. And looking at it in a philosophical perspective, I don't think you're getting out of the model. It's just a more complex
So even
model.
So I shouldn't use the phrase the model is learning something.
It's not
I should
learning
say,
anything.
even if we have designed the model to take in information.
It doesn't take in information.
Oh, sorry.
I would say and it's always for a human purpose at the end of the day. We want some kind of shortcut for some, and by the way, lots of the things that they're providing shortcuts for, probably we should have a shortcut for. These are kind of inhuman jobs anyway.
Right.
And so it'd be great if we, not all of them, but many of them, it'd be great if we could cut them out.
Right.
Fine. No one should write the emails that come from a dean's office. Get something. No human being should be made to write such or think such. Anyway, that's a different issue. But,
no, we do write some of them with ChatGPT.
Well,
I've done a few that way.
So I would like some more specificity on that, because not because I'm just sort of a cranky, crusty philosopher, but because I think that's the truth of the being of these things.
I want to come back to your mentioning will, you know, saying, well, the machine isn't learning, the machine has no desire to learn.
Exactly, yeah.
I think this is an important omission in our machines. I would phrase it more as they do not have emotion. You know, they have the ability to detect emotions. They have the ability to show emotions, but it's fake when they show emotions because they do not actually feel it. When we feel an emotion, we perceive a stimulus and we have a bodily reaction before we actually have a cognitive appraisal of what's going on. The machine doesn't have that bodily reaction. That's why we say we feel emotions because we literally in our body. In fact, if you go back to the Latin names of emotions, most of them have to do with something that happens in the body, like timor, for fear has to do with trembling, that you actually start trembling. Or you get that shot of adrenaline, so you get the fight or flight response. And then you think about, oh, what was the stimulus that just made that happen? But it is emotion that makes us want to do anything. You can't have desires without emotion. And so if you can't have learning without desire, and you can't have desire without emotion, you can't have emotion without a body, you're either going to have to replicate the whole dang body or you're not going to have it.
But it's interesting, I mean, if I could just jump onto that point, because the human body is not its own thing with the soul somehow thrown into it like a ghost in a
No, it's
machine.
not.
It's the soul which in fact unifies and organizes and gives the body its own kind of activity. Such that, I mean, Aquinas will talk about the activities of the soul that are expressed through the body. So I mean, in the human being, there is no body which is not formed by the soul. I mean, you mentioned the things, even the microscopic activities and interactions that are going on within the body are all somehow caught up in a causality, which ultimately goes into a kind of spiritual activity. I mean, right now, all of the things that are going on in my body that are enabling me to make these sounds, but these sounds are giving something like the intelligibility of a reality, and that's clearly a spiritual activity. You can quote me right now, by the way, and if you quote me, which you're, not that what I'm saying is quotable, but if you quote me, what you're doing is bringing to light the very same reality that I am doing to you right now. Well, only a spiritual being can do that, even though I'm using bodily processes to do it. So, I mean, the very life and activity of the body is organized and directed towards something which transcends a level of material causality. And again, quotation, I think, proves that, right? Many other things, human activities prove that, which means that you can't replicate the body, the human body. It's not something that's possible to be done unless you can create a spiritual, immortal, rational soul. And I only know of one God that can do that. So I think that the whole thing is kind of predicated on, I would say, a deep ontological confusion, it seems to me, because the idea seems to be, well, if we could just get enough stuff together, then we'd have what we needed for a human. And the human body is not like that in the beginning at all. I mean, even when I have an emotional response, it's because I'm always responding. I've cognized something as fearful or as appetizing, right? And even those bodily responses, again, are kind of caught up in a causality, which is not merely material. And the other thing I would say, too, is just, I mean, even Plato's notion of eros is a spiritual kind of desire, if we could say it that way. And Aquinas talks about the will as a rational appetite. So I would say in human life, the deepest desires are not just bodily passions, although those are obviously massively important. I would say the deepest desires are the desires of the rational appetite, which again is appetitive, but in a spiritual way. I mean, you mentioned Augustine. My heart is restless until it rests. That's really getting close to a spiritual appetite, or what Plato would call the movement of the soul, which is eros.
Yeah, please.
I want to ask you, Professor.
Sometimes, yeah.
Yeah.
That probably answers the question.
Yeah,
I mean, I look at it from a distance. Obviously interested in it and captivated by it, but no, I don't use them.
May I ask why?
Yeah, it's a good question. How deep do you want to get into that? That's the easiest. That's the easiest answer. A few years ago, well, maybe it's like 5 years ago now. I did have a smartphone at one time because my boss at Lumen Christi forced me to get one, Thomas Levergood. And so I had it for a few years, and I could just feel that it was doing what it was designed to do, addict me to it, and to sort of completely disrupt my own way of thinking, my own way of interacting with things. I was always going back to it, and I felt that not just my attention, but even in some ways my emotional capacity were being dissipated by using it. And so I just said, well, this is ridiculous. And it's the best thing I ever did, was to get rid of it. And so I guess the way I look at it is that AI would have perhaps not the same exact effect on me, but a kind of analogous impact. And I guess that maybe this is just me being a Luddite or something. But I'd rather encounter the things as often as I can by myself, or with others, with other humans, and not through the programming modeling of a machine. I use it when I have to, obviously.
But surely there's a certain virtue in some of the beneficial uses or functions to which we put AI, right? So it's like, it's not like the inherent engagement with an AI tool would necessarily have these negative effects, or is necessarily motivated by, or is it necessarily motivated by some desire to play God? I mean, when we think about healing,
Yeah.
right, like we can say, well, healing is a fundamental biblical,
Sure.
you know, so when we want, but we're using AI to, I'm sure there are people here who can explain this better than me, but I think there's some kind of matching of proteins to, like, you can figure out the protein that you would need to link up, and it's curing things. So I don't know, like, I hear you, and I agree with the sentiment that's driving what you're saying, but I think that it's in attention with the observable outcomes in which AI can do so many things
Sure.
that we would all say, yes, we would like that to happen. We would like to have
Sure.
that. And so then the problem becomes, how do you negotiate that tension? You know, thinking about ethical decision-making and technology and the Neely Center's work on those issues. It just seems like there's a need to find a way to acknowledge the negatives, but also still be able to use the tools.
My feeling is that AI is a wonderful tool and partner. In other words, again, think about the Mars rover. It's up there, it's a great tool, but the information it's sending back needs to be then, correlated, used, thought about by human astronomers. An AI can read an X-ray probably better than a radiologist, and yet the radiologist will be the one who talks to the patient and explains what's going on, so that we work in partnership with it as a tool. But when we try to make a substitution, and that AI is the only thing that works and can't be overridden, then you run into problems. You run into problems when it fails. You run into problems when it needs to be overridden if there isn't a human in the loop to override it. And I think you certainly run into problems, which I'll talk about later this afternoon, when you try to substitute it for other living things.
Well, that's a perfect cue to say to everyone that we hope you'll come back this afternoon, because we have hit time today. So thank you both so much. We really appreciate it.